All right, hey everyone, I am back, Coach Jerry with Coach Marco. Today's conversation is going to revolve around improving an athlete's vertical jump. So Marco spent some good amount of time with the Los Angeles Lakers and was around some of the best athletes that could produce a lot of power, jump really high, and now we're going to kind of pick his brain and kind of collaborate on what makes athletes jump higher and what are some characteristics that are trainable. A lot of times people always talk about how you can't teach speed, which is nonsense. I think you can teach speed. There's a genetic factor, of course, but you can improve someone's speed. Now, can everyone become Olympic sprinter? Probably not. There's some genetics to that, but we can all increase our speed, increase our vertical jump, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So Marco, kind of when we talk about or when we look at vertical jump, what are some characteristics of athletes that jump high? Is it, genetics when we talk about fast twitch, slow twitch fibers? Is it the way that they train? Give me a little insight as far as what comes to mind when you look at someone that has a strong or high vertical jump.
Okay. I mean, I can't deny the fact that genetics does play a role with it. Everybody knows that. To some extent, you have a lot of NBA athletes, a lot of professional athletes that naturally jump high, and it's because genetics, that's who they are, that's what they do.
Yep.
But does it mean that you can't improve it on your own if you don't have that genetic makeup? Of course, you can improve it and stuff like that. But a couple of the components that you always want to focus on, everybody kind of focuses on, on doing jumping drills, which is great to some extent. But what a lot of people tend to neglect is that the key components that are involved with it, whether it's the strength portion of it, building up the muscles that are required, your glutes, your hamstrings, the mechanics behind it. Having the flexibility, the proper mobility to be able to kind of get that extension, especially like from the hip flexors, because if your hip flexors are tight and you try to extend and it's not going to allow you to extend. So when you're trying to go up there and dunk the ball and trying to get that full extension to try to dunk it, if your hip flexors are tight, you're going to kind of stay there. You're going to lose a couple of inches.
Yep.
And you'll be surprised how many times either that you and I talked about it, that if you kind of release your hip flexors, release your quads, without even doing anything else, you may already get a little extra inch and a half right off the bat.
And we're gonna do a video of that just to kind of prove to everyone how powerful mobility can be.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're an athlete that you're gonna get tested, and this is something you can do right before you get tested, you stretch out your hip flexors, and again, we'll record a video how to do it, some of good hip flexor stretches. You're going to gain more vertical jump in your performance, and it's just because you're able to achieve that full hip extension. And you brought up something before we went on air about when you see photos of like Michael Jordan or some of the best dunkers that can you explain really quick what you were mentioning about the hips and open them up?
You and I were talking about right before this, as far as a lot of people tend to do box jumps, and box jumps are a great exercise to work out as far as kind of increase your plyometrics, especially if you kind of pair it up with the squat and then follow with the box jump type of thing, which is great. But at the same time, if you look at the mechanics behind, let's take a slam dunk, when you do a box jump, you tend to get a lot more hip flexion to try to kind of get on top of the box.
And that's the opposite of what you want.
And that's pretty much the opposite. If you ever go back and look at every slam dunk contest, every video of context, I'd be surprised if you ever find a professional athlete while they're up in the air dunking and they have their legs kind of flexed. Their hips their legs are extended. If you go back, if you're an NBA fan or a basketball player, look at the logo of Michael Jordan. He is extended out. Even those videos when he kind of cocks the ball back like this, and his knees are flexed, but his legs are kind of coming back, and then boom, they get that power at the very end. They may get a little bit of hip flex at the end, but that's more for the power of the core to try to get the ball in. But to get up, that initial movement to get up, it's all an extension.
Like if they had a belt buckle, they're going to be showing you that belt buckle, right?
Correct.
They want to, and again, not you don't want to compensate and use a lot of your back to achieve that extension position, but you want your hips to achieve full extension. That means your glutes are be able to maximize their force capabilities, right? So that flexibility is really important, right?
Correct.
So we got to make sure that if you're out there, notice the first thing we didn't talk about was get in the weight room, right? We're going to touch on flexibility as is important if an athlete comes in that wants to improve their vertical jump. And then how about like when we talk about technique and even before loading an athlete, what are some things we want to make sure that athletes are efficient with before we put a barbell? Because I think the very first step when an athlete or a parent or a coach wants to get in the weight room right away and put some weight on, right? And before that, what is something that we want to make sure that we're ticking the boxes before the athlete gets loaded?
Correct, 100%. So, when you talk about related over to as far as whatever sport, whether it's baseball, whether it's soccer, before you kind of get out onto the field and start kicking the ball, start scoring, or whatever you do, everybody needs to learn the basic foundation of that movement and how to kick. That's why in baseball, when you start with little kids, you don't start with little kids where they start underhand, overhand. You start with the tee. That tee. You put the ball there.
Critical.
And the reason why you put the tee there is because you're trying to teach the kids the proper mechanics. And that's one thing that a lot of people tend to neglect is that they'll get in there, hey, yeah, I want to get strong, they want to get big, I want to get those glutes and those hamstrings, and they'll start lifting. But if you don't have those proper mechanics, you'll be surprised at how many kids I've worked with, high school kids or younger, that they'll come in and say, hey, or collegiate athletes, hey, every time I lift, I'm feeling, soreness in the back. I'm feeling this and this and this. I can lift the weight, but I feel like I'm not doing it properly. And I asked them to, hey, you know what? Let's show me how to do a squat. Show me how you squat with no weight. And right off the bat, you'll see how much their mechanics, whether they shift to one side, they have poor dorsiflexion in their ankles. They start hyperextending their back. And then it's almost to the point, okay, well, let's stop. Let's get away from the weight. Let's go back to the original basics foundation of the mechanics. Let's get that mobility. Let's get all that stuff going. And then we start loading your body.
And I think that's critical for even parents to understand this is you may have an athlete that comes in that you think they've been lifting weights, but when professionals like Marco and I, when we get an athlete, whether you're a pro or not, we're always going to start on what I call base zero, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have no load, unloaded, and just see how you move your body. And again, not just with two legs, but unilaterally, one leg. I love the flexibility in the ankle, because that's something that I see a lot with high school athletes is ask them, all right, what do you lift? And they're like, all right, I can squat 315 pounds. I'm like, okay. And then they show me a body weight squat or maybe a very light loaded squat, and their heels are just popping off the ground, right? And we talk about how we can fix that, but sometimes, okay, like if you're wearing Olympic lifting shoes, you may kind of put a Band-Aid over the problem, but you're not really fixing the actual issue, the underlying cause of what's causing that. So can you talk a little bit about, and we'll, again, Marco and I will show you a video. If you have that issue, when you squat with a load or body weight, when your heels are popping off the ground, there's some things that you can do to basically fix that, but even better is to treat the actual underlying cause. And we're going to film a video to show you how to improve your ankle flexibility, mobility. But is there something that you can talk about, kind of the underlying cause of that?
Correct. So there's a couple of issues that, you'll be surprised how many athletes have poor dorsiflexion. And what I mean by dorsiflexion, if you take your ankle and you pretty much kind of try to bend your ankle. So when you're doing a squat, you should have a good amount of dorsiflexion so you kind of be able to do the squat. Because if you don't have good dorsiflexion and we try to do the squat, you're going to start with what's referred to as far as compensating.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to start loading somewhere else, and then that's when you kind of start getting some injuries or some chronic issues. Having great dorsiflexion is probably one of the key things as far as for an athlete, especially if you're playing a sport that requires landing or anything on the ground.
Critical.
Every time you take a step, you want to have that dorsiflexion so you can kind of your foot kind of caves in a little bit to try to take some of the absorption. Otherwise, all that load that's going from you pushing on the ground is going up to your knee, and then you have poor that you can eventually resolve like with an ACL injury, patella tendonitis, quad tendonitis, anything of that sort. So there's a couple of very basic, easy techniques that don't require anything whatsoever. As long as you have a wall and a flat surface, you can do an exercise, and we're going to show you how to do a couple of them to try to increase your dorsiflexion.
Yeah, so we're going to show you a quick assessment on kind of to see if you're making progress, and then Marco's going to demonstrate if you have a band, which every place has a band. You can actually do these like in your warm-ups. You can do them before your practices. Really simple, but it's going to help you be able to squat better, deadlift better, land better, jump better. So again, a lot of times people talk about like, I want to be able to jump higher. So they talk about putting a bigger engine in the car, but it's like, hey, let's learn how to drive the car better. Because if I put this 500 horsepower engine, but you don't know how to drive it, you're going to run off the road. So it's the same concept with your body.
Correct.
You got to learn how to move your body correctly before we start adding in all this crazy and fancier stuff.
100%. Like you said, if in this kind of definition, you can work out and you can lift and you can have a great engine, but if you don't have the proper framework, like let's say if you put a Ferrari engine on a Yugo, that you're not going anywhere. That car is going to either fall apart. It's not going to be able to sustain yourself. And then that's when the injuries occur, because you have the strength, but if you don't have the foundation or the baseline to support that, that's when you get into problems.
And that leads on perfect into our next topic is the importance of strength training. And when we talk about strength training, sometimes, some parents or athletes may think of like bodybuilding. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about like lighter loads where you're doing it for aesthetic reasons. We're talking about strength training where we're activating those high motor units, those fast twitch muscle fibers, the ones that are going to make you jump higher. They are producing a lot of force. So we're talking about, sets of 5 repetitions or less. And again, we're moving into heavier weights. That means you've worked your way into that. You haven't just walked into the weight room and then all of a sudden you're squatting super heavy. You worked your way, but at some point we do want to load the body and load the muscular system, the nervous system, the bone structure, everything to produce force, right? So one thing that one of my coaches just he mentioned was you can't shoot a cannon out of a canoe. Because what happens is if you're in a canoe and you shoot this high force object, the canoe's going to go the opposite direction, and then you're going to have no control of that cannon. So talk about a little bit, and let's kind of open up this discussion on how important strength training is to all athletes, but even more specific, like basketball athletes who tend to not really get a lot of weight room time, especially at the high school level.
Correct. I mean, as far as we kind of go back to the foundation and the mechanics. And I love the example you just said as far as the canoe. So as an athlete, everybody wants to have that big cannon to be able to have the power and be able to shoot. Yep. But if you have that, you can lift and get that bigger cannon. But if you don't have, but if you're still in a small little canoe, you're not going to go anywhere. That's where injuries occur. That's where you get a majority of the chronic issues. So one of the key things as far as for high school athletes or even collegiate athletes that I always try to explain is that you should focus on that canoe. Build that canoe. Once you get the canoe into a big old 70-foot or big ship, then you can put as many, just like the parts of the Caribbean, you can put as many
bigger cannon, multiple cannons,
as many
cannons, and that
you
ship
want,
is going to stay put.
100%. So that's how you kind of should look at it. You shouldn't be focused on, hey, I need to get that bigger cannon. I need to get a bigger ship first, and once you get the bigger ship, then you can put as many cannons as you want, or bigger cannons.
Yeah, so I mean, again, that's something that, and you got to earn that right to lift heavy. It's one of those things where first, how Marco talked about is, does your technique work well? And then we move into maybe like one thing I like to do is when athletes come in the beginning, I spend some time in a hypertrophy phase, right? And hypertrophy is just building muscle because I want to make sure the athlete knows how to control their body with some load. And then 2, I want them to develop some muscle, right? Some quads, some glutes, some hamstrings. So when we start to lift heavy, they can actually produce force, right? So I always spend a good 4, maybe 6 weeks in the off season, preferably in a hypertrophy phase, get them a little stronger, a little bit more muscular. And then we introduce like a strength phase, right? We do a 2 to 4 week, maybe periodized strength program where we're lifting heavy, not everything, but we're doing at least 1 or 2 main lifts every single workout. So it could be like a squat or a deadlift. I usually kind of alternate those bad boys, do 1 single leg movement and then some pull-ups or push-ups and things like that. So I think it's one of those things where, one, you got to earn that right, but the strength aspect is critical, and not just to performance, but you mentioned about injury resistance, right? It's like that is going to make you a resilient athlete. You can't be a weak athlete and be fragile, essentially, because that's where, again, that canoe is going to go the opposite direction when you shoot out that cannon, right?
100%. And that's the thing about it as far as building the mechanics, having the eccentric load to try to kind of resist or sustain you. You have that what's referred to stability when the injury occurs. If you look at majority of ACL injuries, it's never when the athlete pushes off or he's lifting weight. It's when he lands in the eccentric phase, exactly, to try to the body to sustain themselves from a change of direction. That is where the injury occurs. And if you're weak in the eccentric phase because you haven't focused, just like what he was talking about, we go, and I apologize if we're going to go back to the canoe.
Yep.
Think of it, you have to have the canoe. The canoe has to be stable. You have to have a large ship to be able to sustain all that power that you're going to be building. Because if, like you said, if you have a small canoe and you try to put 3 or 4 cannons in there, you're going to fire it. You're more likely that the canoe's going to sink.
Yeah, exactly. So again, strength training, we got to make sure ideally in the off season we build that up. And now that we talked about from the get-go, we talk about flexibility, talk about technique, we move into how important strength training is. Now let's look at the power aspect, right? And that's the sexy stuff. That's where 90% of athletes that walk into my training facility, they want to be faster, more explosive, first step quickness. They're not necessarily looking to bench press 500 pounds. They want to become a better athlete. And when it comes to power, and what I always look at is the rate of force production, right? So it's not so much how much force you can produce. If you're strong, that's great. but how fast you can produce it. Because if you look at sports, sprinting, jumping, hitting, throwing, everything is milliseconds, right?
Yep.
So all this force needs to be produced quickly. And that's where we get into power training, right? We do jump training. We do exercises with chains and bands to kind of make sure we deload at the bottom portion where we don't have a mechanical advantage, and then we accelerate the weight. But what are some of maybe your favorite exercises, or how do you look at the framework of getting an athlete more explosive and developing power?
Great. So can I touch on what you just mentioned as far as trying to produce, how to train your body, how to produce that power.
Yeah.
But if we take it to a step further, it's not only how to produce the power initially for one time, but be able to reproduce that power consecutively.
That's a great point.
Especially if you're in any sport, whether it's volleyball, whether it's basketball. Because last time I checked, if you're rebounding the ball, you're not just going to jump once. You got to either jump again and land and be able to reproduce that power.
And sprinting. I mean, people don't even think about sprinting. That's a power exercise.
Correct,
right?
100%. That's kind of what you had mentioned that earlier, and that's what I was going to kind of lead into as far as sprinting is probably one of the best plyometric exercises because you're spending the least amount of time on the ground. You have to be able to reproduce that plyometric, that sprint, that coil as quickly as possible. So if you do like an exercise that I love doing, let's say you do the box jump, that's great. You do the one box jump, but what I rather focus on is you do a box drop, where you're on top of a box, you land, and then you jump up again, because now you're creating that spring effect that you're training your muscles to do that.
Stress shortening cycle.
Exactly.
So he brought up a great point about kind of the repetitive aspect of sports, right? So you're not, maybe the only time I could see is like if you're doing a shot put where you're throwing it one time. That's one of those kind of outliers, but almost or maybe a goalie where you got to dive one, but you still got to get up off the ground and push yourself. So there's multiple aspects of power over time. Besides, again, you can maybe a golf swing, okay, one time, but there's still going to be benefits over the long. You got 18 holes, so you're going to be at least hitting that ball as maximally for 18 times. But when we talk about power, right? When we talk about power, a lot of times people talk about Olympic lifting, people talk about box jumps, but I have a chart here that basically outlines what we talked about earlier about ground contact time. So when we talk about plyos, they kind of classify it as how much time you're spending on the ground, right? So when we look at have about 5 or 6 different movements, and then they've measured their ground contact time. So what we want is the least amount of time spent on the ground. So when it comes to the first one is race walking. So you're spending, every time you take a step when you're race walking, about 270 to 300 milliseconds every single step. So relatively slow, right? We have another one where a lot of times when people want to get more explosive, they think of the counter movement and jump, where your hands go up, hands go down, and then you jump. That one is even higher, so 500 milliseconds. So it's classified as slow. So if you want to get more powerful, that might not be your best bet, right? And then we talk about, now let's move a little faster. Now we go into the long jump, right? So that one's classified as about 140 to 170 milliseconds. So a little quicker, less time spent on the ground. And then the depth jump that you were talking about, where you step off the box and then you go into a vertical jump, is about 130 up to about 300 milliseconds. So much faster, right? But we can also, if an athlete is not really good at producing force, they're going to spend way more time.
Correct.
And they're going to squat into it versus more of a kind of ankle where you're popping off the ground relatively quickly. And guess what? The basketball layup shot is 218 milliseconds. So again, it's quick, but here's number one is sprinting. Sprinting, they've measured 80 to 90 milliseconds of ground contact time. So that is extremely short periods of time spent on the ground. So even though you want to jump higher, one of the best exercises to become more explosive and more powerful is to sprint.
Correct.
Right? And again, there's nothing you can reproduce in the weight room or on the court or on the field that's better at producing high amounts of velocity with very short ground contact times than sprinting, right? And I mean, so when you were with the Lakers organization, the athletes that you currently train, even if they're not, again, sprinters, and you had mentioned earlier about the other day we were talking is, in basketball, you're not necessarily going to reach maximal speeds because your constraint is the court, right? And depending on your position, can you talk a little bit as far as why it's important to still sprint, even if you're never going to, reach maximal speeds during the sport?
Correct. Correct. So if you look at a basketball court and the distance, odds are that when you get the ball down and you bring it down the court, odds are that you're never ever, or you're gonna rarely ever gonna reach full speed, top end speed, because by the time you pass the half court, there's gonna be defenders. Most likely you have to start slowing down to be able to do a layup, jump up, dunk, or whatever it is, or change the direction, pass the ball. There's probably, you and I were talking, I think yesterday about it, and the only player that probably pops in my mind that if we were to test them, maybe Russell Westbrook. I mean, I've seen the kid where he takes the ball and he just boom, as soon as from the rebound, his acceleration that he probably gets to top speed pretty quicker than most people. Other than that, trying to think of any other player off the top of my head. I'm sure you guys can think of maybe one or two other than that, but it's rare that you do that. So, learning the speed, learning as far as the time spent on the ground time is one of the key components. That's what you were talking about. Yep. As far as a lot of people do the counter movement jumps, a lot of people do the box jumps, but that's not, especially if you're underneath the basket, that's not really productive, because you've got to be springing back and forth. So doing exercises in your weight room or in the sort that's going to reproduce it, that's what you want to try to do.
And it's even like you mentioned earlier about going up for the rebound 2 times. Like,
correct.
If you try to go for a rebound, let's just say you're battling with someone, you miss it, you're not going to go down to the ground, load, bend your knees. You're going to get on the ground and then try to get back up as fast. You're not even going to basically load your hips that much. It's going to be more of an ankle and knee bend and then get back up. So it's like, it doesn't mean counter movement jumps or box jumps don't have a place in your training program, but if that's all you're doing and you're not doing the bounds where it's more, the power is more happening at the ankle and knee kind of complex, and the Achilles is and the calves and those types of muscles are the ones that are producing that force, where it's minimal ground contact time. Bounds are one of those things where I see a lot of sprinters and some of the best kind of jumpers doing a lot more of than doing counter movement jumps. Correct, just 100%. Because it takes too long. It takes too long.
One of my favorite exercises, and I know we're going to probably talk about this later down right now, is jumping rope.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Jumping rope. I mean, you can go buy a jump rope at
$2
at $2 at the Dollar Tree store. Anywhere for $2 at Target, Kmart, or whatever it is. Jumping ropes is going to be replicating basically the same amount of movement, and that's probably one of my favorite exercises to do.
Ooh, so you got to make sure if you're an athlete, and again, not only are you getting that aspect, but you're getting some power endurance, because you're having to do that not just one time. And again, it doesn't mean you have to do it forever, but it's like you can use it as a warm up. Right, you can use it as a cool down essentially, but you can use it anytime you're strengthening up that Achilles, the foot muscles, the calves, all the way up the chain, and you're getting some endurance and some conditioning aspects. So that's 100%. A great point. It's one of the best tools you can get if you're an athlete is a jump rope, right? But here's the one thing I would say is, if you're not an athlete, right? I have some, personal training clients. I know that's not the topic today, but you also got to be careful. Like, if you're not prepared to handle that force at your ankle, or if you're coming off an injury, might not be the best tool to use initially, right? So just make sure if you're just a fitness person and you have been exercising sometime, I wouldn't recommend buying a jump rope because you can do some damage down there. But as Marco was talking, if you're an athlete and you're prepared yourself for this, it's a freaking phenomenal tool. So then let's move into kind of sports, right? So we've been talking about basketball, but when we look at a basketball athlete, or even within the sport, we can talk about the position, right? Think of a center or a power forward versus your guards. I'm thinking, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I learned this from you, where we talked about it, where your bigger guys or girls are going to be jumping more off of 2-leg. Your guards, your faster ones, are going to be doing the layups and doing more unilateral stuff. So even within the sport, the athletes are jumping differently. They're landing differently, and we can extend that out to different sports. Think of a goalie. Think of a tennis athlete where they have to jump with an actual object in their hand. But can you maybe talk about a little bit how maybe we can individualize some training and making sure that each athlete on that given team or within that sport is getting what they need?
Correct. So, I mean, if you look in basketball, like I was telling Jerry yesterday, is that if you differentiate between a 5 or 4, which is a center or power forward, and then a 1 or 2, which is a point guard or shooting guard, their method of jumping, or the vertical jump, whether it's 2 feet or 1 feet, is completely different. So I'll give you an example. When we used to bring players during for the NBA draft and we used to test them, I always knew that if I got a 4 or 5, a center or power forward, and they would jump off 2 feet, they had a pretty good number. As soon as they were done with the 2 feet jump, I would have them do a single leg jump. And it's kind of funny, but they would get, let's say off the 2 feet jump, they would get about a 32 inch, right? Okay. And then I would ask them to go off 1 foot. Now you would think that going off 1 foot, you should get a huge dramatic increase. But some of these 5 centers would maybe only increase by 2 inches. And I was like, all right. And then the reverse concept is if I were to get a point guard or a shooting guard and I asked them to jump at 2 feet, they would probably maybe give me a 28 or a 30. But all of a sudden, if I ask them to jump up 1 foot, they'll skyrocket to like a 36-inch vertical, 38-inch vertical, 40-inch vertical. So now we get into the more the sport specific, or I should more position specific to the exercise and the plyometric movement. Soccer, same thing. You have your goalie, which is going to get a lot more full extension. If you take a goalie and then you take a player inside the field, because obviously as a soccer player, you're not allowed to use your hands.
Yep.
So an exercise where you do like the squat jumps where you keep your hands on your side because you're trying to get more of the power, you can get a little more because you're using more of a header type of thing, where a goalie is using more of the arms to try to stretch out. So you got to kind of be more position specific to what you're doing.
And it's like, if you look at one thing, I mean, a lot of times we talk about the power, the force production capability. One thing that I think a lot of athletes don't keep in mind is if you can produce a lot of power, right, a lot of force, but if you're producing it not efficiently in the right direction, it doesn't serve you. And this is why I love, like, if somebody wants to run faster, one of the best tools is a sled or a prowler, because it teaches athletes how to produce force down and backwards, right? Yep. So if I want to run that way, my force needs to go down and into the ground, pushing back.
Driving.
So it teaches versus like doing high knees. I'm not a big high knee fan because it teaches you how to push force vertically down into the ground. Doesn't make me go that direction, right? So when it comes to, like you brought up, the goalie, is that goalie needs to be able to not only produce going straight up, but they need to be able to produce on one leg, right? Mainly on one leg. If I want to jump and try to block the ball, I need to be able to produce down and laterally along with some rotation. So it's like those exercises for that goalie are going to differ. I might have them do sled drags, but I might have them walk laterally with the sled drag and teaching them force production laterally, right? More one single leg dominant type of thing. Maybe, and you had mentioned like jumping with the band laterally and things like that. So you got to be very creative and kind of look at the sport and look at the demands of the movements and try to tailor those exercises to your given athlete.
Correct, 100%. And then you can also incorporate lateral box jumps side to side. If you pick another sport, you could just kind of popped in my head. Baseball. If you look at shortstops, as far as they're doing a lot more lateral side to side, as far as reacting to the ball coming at them.
Yep.
That's another great specific sport. Either whether you're an infielder, third baseman, shortstop, both take all of them, first base and second base.
Yeah, and last thing on that point is you talked about when we go back to that flexibility. It's like, think if you're a goalie, right? Imagine you're a goalie and you're able to increase your range of motion, and you talked about like stretching out their lats. If you can get an inch further on your range of motion of your reach, essentially, when you jump to block a ball, that is the difference between you making contact with that ball with your fingertips versus maybe the palm of your hand, and you deflect that ball doesn't go in. Like, it's literally that big of a difference. Where at the highest of levels, all these little details matter. Or if you want to be the best at your position, you got to be willing to do things and focus more on what's going to actually help you with the sport and check your ego, and not just think, I want to lift heavy weights. You got to look into all these small little details that the coaches like Marco and myself are going to look at and improve. And some of these drills are going to be really basic. They're not going to leave you super sweaty, but they're going to be effective. Right?
Correct. And I think that's kind of like what you just mentioned, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of people tend to neglect or don't like doing it, because if they don't get the sweat, or if they don't see right away
burn
exactly, then they don't want to do it because they don't feel like they're not doing anything.
Yeah.
But going back to the comment as far as the soccer goalie, you can have all the power strength, the plyometric strength to be able to do it. But if he and I were to tell you, hey, you know what, do all that stuff, do what you need to do to try to get all that power. But if you were to do some mobility, some flexibility, and that guarantees you at least another inch or two on your stretching when you're trying to kind of block a goal, and like you mentioned, if the ball goes right past your finger, but if you're able to get just past it to get a little extra 2 inches by increasing mobility and flexibility, I'm sure you're going to want to do it.
Game changer, right? At the end of the day, athletes come to us to get better. They want to become better athletes. They don't want to become better weightlifters or Olympic lifters. They want to become better athletes. So we can give you a program that's going to make you enhance your sport performance. I'm sure you'll gladly take that, whether it makes you sweat or not, over just giving you a workout, right? So lastly, let's talk about exercises, right? And I think we're gonna go into this episode into a new one. The next one we're gonna talk more specifically on exercise selection and things like that, because I think there's a lot of exercises that one they don't get programmed into the high school level, maybe the college level, because one, they don't have the resources, maybe they don't have a trap bar, they don't have the coaches enough to do these programs. They're much more individualized. But let's stick with vertical jumping. What are some of your favorite exercises, whether they're weight training exercise or body weight, jumps, things like that? But what are some of your go-tos if an athlete comes to you and says, hey, Marco, I want to increase my vertical jump. What's your meat and potatoes?
The ones I love doing, doing the broad jump with the athletes, and the reason why the broad jump versus more of a box jump is because when you do a broad jump, it's more sport specific or position specific. Because when you jump, you try to get that full extension, versus when you do a box jump, you're trying to get more hip flexion to try to get your feet on top of the box. I love doing that.
Great point.
I love doing like a single leg triple jump, because now I can also be able to distinguish how much power you get between your right leg and the left leg. But it also helps me distinguish how much stability you have in your legs, especially if you're in any position, whether you're a soccer player where you have to kind of pivot, land, and kind of explode to that one side to either jump up and get a header if the ball's coming from like a corner kick, whether you're a basketball player or anything of that sort. The broad jump I enjoy a lot, and probably the triple jump is probably one of my two favorite ones to do.
Okay. Yeah, and for me, I think those are great. I think the triple jump is an interesting point where you can almost, because I used to work with the track and field team, and you can tell when an athlete lacks hip, knee, and ankle stability right away when you
Correct.
have them do these types of jumps, because they just collapse. Like they hit the ground and they just kind of sink into it, where they have no stability in their, in their hip and their knee. They're just so fragile, so weak, where you can instantly tell, yeah, that athlete needs to work on their strength and their stability aspect, because they just collapse almost like they're sinking in mud every single time versus being more springy and things like
100%.
that, right? But I personally love, like, when it comes to like strength training, I mean, definitely have a squat. I'm not a big back squat guy. I personally love more of a front squat. To me, it's safer. It gets the athlete much more in a better position to squat versus with the back on their a bar on their back. They tend to hunch a lot more. When you hunch on a front squat, the weight comes down, so they can't really mess up the exercise. So I love front squats. Single leg, like pistols, are great for me, because again, you're not only getting the strength aspect, but you're getting the stability aspect. But any type of lateral lunge, I mean, again, a lot of times we're talking forward and back, but sometimes we neglect that sagittal plane, the frontal plane, where we're moving side to side, right? And then probably I would say the last one might be some type of like single leg RDL, getting the hamstrings, the glutes. And again, you can load these exercises up if you've earned the right by demonstrating ability to execute the exercises correctly. Yeah. So those are some of mine, where those are my go-tos, where somebody wants to they want to jump higher. I want to make sure that they're getting strong in the right muscle groups, the right areas. And then lastly, I would say just technique. If somebody literally just wants to jump higher, I can stretch out their hip flexors, teach them how to use their arms better, and I guarantee you I can make you jump at least 2 inches higher. Like I almost surprise some parents sometimes. I'm like, all right, you want vertical jump? I'm like, you're going to pay me if I improve their vertical jump? They're like, yeah. I'm like, all right, you're going to pay me for 5 minutes of work. I'm going to stress them out. I'm going to test them on my vertical jump tester before, stretch out their hip flexors, teach them how to use their arms more effectively, and instantly they jump higher. And I just asked the parent, like, all right, today's session's over. Give me that money.
Yeah, but that's the interesting part about it, is that everybody forgets, and I hate to go back to your example of the canoe and the cannons. Everybody wants that bigger cannon because that's what you see, but everybody forgets about the canoe. And once you stabilize and once you get that canoe, or you get that big ship, you can put as many cannons as you want.
100%. All right, so today's episode was all about getting an athlete to improve their vertical jump. We're going to continue to do more of these videos, and if you have any topics that you want Marco and myself to talk about, drop the comments in the comment section below, whether you're watching it on YouTube or you're watching it on one of our social medias. But just leave a comment. If you're an athlete, if you're a coach, or if you're a high school coach and you want us to come out and give some talks on a variety of topics, let us know. We'll come out and give you guys a presentation about injury prevention, a warm-up routine, how to use the weight room in 25-30 minutes effectively. So things like that. If that's something you're interested in, reach out to Marco and myself. Where can people find you at, Marco?
So you can find me either on Instagram at Marco A. Nunez 17 or through performance_athletic_Nunez or by email at Marco A. Nunez at MSN.com.
Awesome. So I'll leave all that info in the description section. But yeah, till next time, we'll come back with another episode of discussing sports performance related topics, making sure you're getting the right information, because this is what we do. This is our passion. This is what we live and breathe. There's a lot of bad information floating now. So part of the goal of us coming together is to get you some evidence-based knowledge and allow you to make sure you're getting what you're paying for, right? A lot of times there's a lot of programs that are not founded on scientific methods or experienced coaches who have proven results, and that's why we do this, is to make sure that everyone that's watching this or hearing this is getting great information. So again, till next time, if you have any comments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and shoot us a comment, and maybe even share this episode of where you're watching it. And till next time, me and Marco will come back with another episode